Power doesn't always announce itself with screaming sirens or a tailored suit. Sometimes, it waits patiently in the shadows, wearing a faded jacket, watching the wicked hang themselves. When two crooked patrolmen decided to harass a solitary black man on a rainy evening, they thought they caught a nobody. They caught the apex predator. The rain in the city didn't wash the streets clean. It only made the grime slicker. It was a miserable, bone-chilling Tuesday night in the South Side district, a neighborhood that had been abandoned by the city's politicians and left to the mercies of the 42nd Precinct. Inside Patrol Car 44, the heater rattled with a failing rhythmic wheeze. Officer Bradley Jenkins leaned back against the headrest, picking at his teeth with a plastic matchstick. Jenkins was a 12-year veteran of the force, a man whose original ideals had long since eroded into a cynical, opportunistic greed. He possessed the thick neck and heavy jaw of a barroom brawler, and his uniform strained around his waistline. Beside him sat Officer Thomas Miller, 5 years out of the academy and thoroughly corrupted by his senior partner's mentorship. Miller was leaner, more nervous, his eyes constantly darting around the rain-swept avenues like a scavenger looking for an easy meal. "Quiet night," Miller muttered, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. "Almost too quiet." "We haven't met our quota for the shift, Brad. Captain Hayes is going to be breathing down our necks tomorrow." Jenkins let out a short, guttural laugh. "Relax, Tommy. We'll find a rabbit. We always find a rabbit. The South Side is full of people who don't know their rights, don't have the money for a lawyer, and are too scared to look us in the eye. Remember Old Man Henderson last week? A broken taillight turned into a $200 on-the-spot fine. Easy money." Miller chuckled nervously, adjusting his utility belt. They operated not as protectors of the peace, but as an occupying force taxing the locals. They profiled, they intimidated, and they stole, and for years, they had gotten away with it. The 42nd Precinct was a notoriously insulated brotherhood. Internal affairs complaints went into a shredder. Dashcams mysteriously malfunctioned during arrests. They believed they were gods in blue uniforms. 3 blocks away, Arthur Pendleton was walking down the cracked pavement of Elm Street. Arthur did not look like a god. He looked like an ordinary, tired man on his way home from a grueling late shift. He was a 58-year-old black man, built solid like a retired linebacker, wearing a simple navy peacoat over a gray hooded sweatshirt. The hood was pulled up to shield his head from the freezing drizzle. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets. But Arthur Pendleton was not an ordinary man. He was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Appointed 3 years prior, Arthur had built his career not behind a mahogany desk, but in the trenches. He had spent 2 decades busting organized crime syndicates, dismantling cartels, and rooting out public corruption. He possessed a mind like a steel trap and a temperament carved from glacier ice. Arthur was in the city completely incognito. For 14 months, a covert FBI task force had been running a quiet, airtight investigation into the systemic corruption rotting the 42nd Precinct. They had informants, wiretaps, and a mountain of financial discrepancies pointing directly to Captain Hayes and his squad of thugs. The raid was scheduled for Friday morning, but Arthur, a man who refused to authorize a massive operation without understanding the ground truth, had decided to fly in early. He left his security detail at the Federal Building downtown, donned civilian clothes, and took a subway to the South Side. He wanted to see the streets for himself. He wanted to feel the atmosphere of a neighborhood living under the boot of corrupt police. He walked with a measured, deliberate pace. The rain drummed against his shoulders. He was mentally reviewing the case files, the extortion rackets, the falsified evidence, the unlawful detentions when the piercing glare of high-beam headlights suddenly washed over him, casting a long, stark shadow against the brick wall of an abandoned storefront. In Patrol Car 44, Jenkins sat forward, spitting his plastic matchstick onto the floorboard. Well, look what we have here." Miller squinted through the rhythmic slapping of the windshield wipers. Just a guy walking in the rain, Brad. Doesn't look like he's doing anything. He's wearing a hood, walking alone at midnight in a high-crime area, Jenkins said, his voice dropping into a predatory growl. He fits the description. Description of what? Miller asked, confused. There hasn't been a call over the radio in an hour. Jenkins shot his partner a look of profound impatience. The description of a guy who looks like he's got warrants, Tommy. Or drugs. Or cash he can't explain. Look at him. Black male, concealing his face, acting suspicious. That's all the probable cause we need to have a little chat. Hit the cherries. Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached up and flicked the switch. The red and blue strobe lights erupted, painting the wet pavement and the surrounding buildings in chaotic, flashing colors. The cruiser's tires hissed against the asphalt as Miller swerved the car aggressively toward the curb, cutting off Arthur's path and forcing him to stop. Arthur halted. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn to run. He merely lowered his hood, revealing a face lined with experience and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He watched the two officers step out of their vehicle. He immediately noted their badge numbers, the way Jenkins left his hand resting casually on the butt of his service weapon, and the lack of a functioning dash cam on their cruiser. Badge 4,000, 402 and 5,000, 119. Arthur registered silently. Let's see how you operate. Hey, you! Stop right there and keep your hands where I can see them, Jenkins barked, slamming his car door shut. The rain pelted his uniform, but the adrenaline of the hunt seemed to make him impervious to the cold. The trap had just been set. But Jenkins had no idea who was actually standing inside it. I haven't moved, officer, Arthur replied. His voice was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of the panic Jenkins was accustomed to hearing. Jenkins swaggered forward, closing the distance while Miller flanked Arthur to the right, his hand hovering nervously over his own holster. Jenkins stopped a mere 2 feet from Arthur, invading his personal space, shining a heavy, tactical flashlight directly into Arthur's eyes. "Where are you going in such a hurry, buddy?" Jenkins demanded, the smell of stale coffee and chewing tobacco rolling off his breath. "I am taking a walk," Arthur said calmly, turning his face slightly to avoid the blinding beam of the flashlight. "I wasn't aware that was a crime in this city." "Don't get smart with me," Jenkins sneered. "People don't just take walks at midnight in the South Side unless they're up to no good. Selling, buying, or casing a joint. Which one is it?" "None of the above," Arthur stated. "Are you detaining me, officer, or am I free to go?" The calm, authoritative tone of the question made Jenkins bristle. He hated it when the citizens he preyed upon knew the law. It was an affront to his authority. "You're not going anywhere. Give me your ID. Now." "On what grounds?" Arthur asked, keeping his hands perfectly still at his sides. "You haven't articulated reasonable suspicion of a crime. Under the Fourth Amendment, I am not obligated to identify myself simply because I am walking down a public street." Miller shifted uncomfortably. Brad, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Tommy!" Jenkins snapped, his face flushing red with anger. He turned his attention back to Arthur, his hostility escalating. "Oh, we got a constitutional scholar here. A real sidewalk lawyer. Let me explain the law of the street to you, pal. I am the law out here. When I tell you to jump, you ask how high. When I ask for your ID, you hand it over, or I put you in cuffs for obstruction." "Obstruction requires a lawful order," Arthur corrected him, his voice as steady as a metronome. "Your order is unlawful. You are currently engaging in an illegal stop, Officer Jenkins." Jenkins' eyes widened. He read my name tag. The defiance was intolerable. Without another word, Jenkins lunged forward. He grabbed Arthur by the lapels of his peacoat, spinning him violently around and slamming him chest first against the cold, wet hood of the patrol car. Arthur's jaw tightened, but he did not resist. He knew the protocol. He knew that physical resistance would only give these corrupt cops the justification they desperately wanted to use their batons or their firearms. Instead, Arthur's analytical mind went to work. documenting every single violation of civil rights and departmental policy. "Spread your legs!" Jenkins yelled, kicking Arthur's right ankle apart. Miller stepped closer, looking around nervously to see if anyone was watching from the dark windows of the surrounding apartment buildings. "Brad, take it easy. We don't have a reason to search him." "Officer safety, Tommy. He's acting hostile." Jenkins lied loudly, justifying the unlawful search for the non-existent audience. Jenkins' heavy hands patted down Arthur's sides, patting down his pockets with rough, invasive force. From Arthur's left pocket, Jenkins retrieved a black, encrypted government smartphone. From his right, he pulled out a slim, leather wallet. Jenkins tossed the phone onto the hood of the car and eagerly flipped open the wallet. Inside, there was a stack of crisp $50 and $100 bills, travel per diem and emergency cash that the director always carried. Jenkins let out a low whistle, a greedy smirk spreading across his face. He held the cash up for Miller to see. "Well, look at this, Tommy. A grand total of looks like at least $1,000. Now, what is a guy like you doing with this kind of cash in this neighborhood? You don't look like an investment banker." "It is my personal property," Arthur said, his cheek pressed against the wet metal of the cruiser. "And I highly recommend you put it back, Officer Jenkins. Badge number 4402. Officer Miller. Badge 5119. You are crossing a line from which you will not be able to return." "Are you threatening me?" Jenkins hissed, leaning his full body weight against Arthur's back. "I am stating a fact," Arthur replied coldly. "You have no probable cause. You have no reasonable suspicion. You have conducted an illegal search and seizure. Every second you continue this charade multiplies the severity of the federal charges you will eventually face." Jenkins laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the empty street. Federal charges? The very idea was absurd to him. They owned the South Side. The judges believed them. The captain protected them. "Federal charges," Jenkins mocked, shaking his head. "You hear that, Tommy? We got a comedian. Tell you what, funny man. I think this cash is proceeds from narcotics sales. I'm seizing it under civil asset forfeiture." Jenkins quickly slipped the stack of bills into his own breast pocket, bypassing the evidence bag entirely. Arthur's eyes narrowed. Armed robbery under the color of law. The final nail in the coffin. "And as for you," Jenkins continued, unclipping his handcuffs from his belt, "I'm taking you in for resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, and whatever else I decide to write on the report when we get back to the station." Click! Click! The heavy, cold steel of the handcuffs locked tightly around Arthur's wrists. Jenkins wrenched Arthur's arms upward, forcing a grimace of pain from the older man, before yanking him away from the hood of the car. "Get in the back," Jenkins ordered, shoving Arthur aggressively toward the rear door of the cruiser. Miller opened the door, refusing to meet Arthur's eyes. As Arthur ducked his head to slide into the cramped, hard plastic seat of the patrol car, he looked directly at Miller. "You had a chance to stop this, son," Arthur said quietly. "Remember that." Miller swallowed hard, slamming the door shut. He hurried around to the passenger seat, his stomach twisting into an uneasy knot. Something about the man in the back didn't sit right with him. Thugs yelled. Thugs panicked. Thugs pleaded. This man was completely, terrifyingly calm. Jenkins slid into the driver's seat, thoroughly pleased with himself. He turned around, peering through the metal cage at Arthur. "You're going to learn a hard lesson tonight, old man," Jenkins sneered, putting the car into drive. "Welcome to the 42nd Precinct." As the patrol car accelerated away from the curb, driving deeper into the rainy night, Arthur sat upright in the back seat. He felt the cold steel digging into his wrists, but he felt no fear. He felt only a profound, icy resolve. Tucked deep inside the lining of his peacoat, in a hidden pocket Jenkins' sloppy search had missed, was a solid brass credential case bearing the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Arthur looked out the window at the passing city lights. Yes, he thought, his jaw setting into a hard line. "We are all going to learn a very hard lesson tonight." The 42nd Precinct was a decaying fortress of concrete and frosted glass, reeking of stale sweat, cheap ammonia floor wax, and decades of unchallenged arrogance. It was a place where the law was not upheld, but rather bent, broken, and sold to the highest bidder. When Patrol Car 44 pulled into the Sallyport, the heavy steel garage doors groaning shut behind them, Arthur Pendleton was effectively sealed inside the belly of the beast. Jenkins yanked Arthur out of the back seat by the chain of his handcuffs, ignoring the way the metal bit into the older man's wrists. "Move it, Grandpa!" Jenkins barked, shoving Arthur toward the heavy double doors leading to the intake booking area. Officer Miller trailed behind, his eyes darting nervously. The entire ride back, Arthur's silence had gnawed at him. Suspects usually begged, bargained, or shouted obscenities. They didn't sit with the terrifying, upright posture of a general inspecting a poorly disciplined infantry. They hauled Arthur into the brightly lit intake room. Behind a raised wooden desk sat Desk Sergeant William O'Malley, a pale, balding man with a chronic cough and a uniform that looked like it hadn't been washed in a week. O'Malley looked up from a crossword puzzle, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses. "What did you drag in out of the rain, Brad?" O'Malley asked, his voice a raspy drawl. "Caught a live one on Elm Street, Sarge," Jenkins boasted, forcefully pushing Arthur against the booking counter. Suspicious behavior, evading, and resisting arrest. Refused to identify himself. "I'm thinking he's a mule, or casing the block for a B&E. O'Malley sighed, pulling a blank intake form toward him. "Name?" he demanded, looking at Arthur. "I will provide my name to the commanding officer of this precinct, and no one else," Arthur replied, his voice echoing off the cinder-block walls. O'Malley snorted, exchanging an amused glance with Jenkins. "We got a tough guy. Put his property on the desk, Brad. We'll run his prints and find out who he is anyway." Jenkins reached into his pocket and tossed Arthur's encrypted government smartphone onto the scratched wooden surface. It landed with a heavy, metallic thud. Arthur looked directly at Sergeant O'Malley. "Take careful inventory, Sergeant. Officer Jenkins is currently withholding $1,200 in U.S. currency that he removed from my right coat pocket. He explicitly stated he was seizing it under civil asset forfeiture. Yet he has bypassed standard evidentiary procedure and placed the funds directly into his own uniform pocket." The intake room went dead silent. Miller swallowed hard, taking a step back. O'Malley looked at Jenkins, raising an eyebrow. Jenkins' face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. "The guy is a liar and a junkie, Sarge." He didn't have any cash on him, just the burner phone. O'Malley held Arthur's gaze for a long moment. He knew Jenkins was lying. Everyone in the 42nd knew Jenkins skimmed off the top. But the blue wall of silence held firm. O'Malley looked back down at his paperwork. "I only see a phone here, buddy. If you want to file a complaint, you can fill out a form in about 6 months when you make bail. Conspiracy to commit robbery, falsifying police records, and accessory after the fact." Arthur mentally logged, adding O'Malley to the rapidly growing list of federal indictments. "I know my rights," Arthur stated smoothly. "I am entitled to a telephone call." "Put him in holding cell 3, Jenkins sneered, grabbing Arthur's arm again. "Let him use the wall phone. See if his crackhead friends can scrape together a bond." They marched Arthur down a narrow, flickering corridor and shoved him into a cramped holding cell, smelling strongly of urine and bleach. Jenkins unhooked the handcuffs, but only because precinct policy strictly forbade leaving cuffed prisoners in cells due to liability. "There's the phone." Jenkins pointed to a battered metal receiver bolted to the wall. "Dial carefully." "It's the only lifeline you've got, old man." Jenkins slammed the heavy iron bars shut, the lock engaging with a loud, final clack. He and Miller walked away, laughing quietly to themselves, leaving Arthur alone in the dim light. Arthur calmly rubbed his wrists, restoring the blood flow. He walked over to the metal wall phone. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't call a bail bondsman. He dialed a secure, unlisted number that routed directly to the temporary command post of the FBI's regional field office, located just 4 miles away. It rang exactly once. "Director?" A sharp, alert voice answered. It was Special Agent in Charge Richard Campbell, the man heading the covert anti-corruption task force. "Richard," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, losing any trace of the civilian victim he had been playing. "I am currently locked in holding cell 3 at the 42nd Precinct. I have been unlawfully detained, physically assaulted, and robbed by Officers Bradley Jenkins and Thomas Miller. Desk Sergeant William O'Malley is complicit." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Are you injured, sir?" "I am perfectly fine." "They, however, are out of time," Arthur said coldly. "We are not waiting for Friday. The rot is deeper than we anticipated. It is brazen, and it is systemic." "Understood, sir," Sack Campbell said, his voice hardening into a tactical cadence. "What are your orders?" "Execute Operation Cerberus. Immediate breach and clear. Secure the perimeter, lock down all communications, and send the hostage rescue team to my location. I want every single badge in this building confiscated. HRT is wheels up in 2 minutes, Director. We are bringing the hammer down." Arthur hung up the receiver. He turned around, smoothed the wrinkles out of his peacoat, and sat down on the hard metal bench. The trap was sprung. Now, he just had to wait for the jaws to snap shut. Upstairs, in the meticulously furnished office of the precinct commander, Captain Robert Hayes was pouring himself a glass of expensive, 20-year-old scotch. Hayes was a polished, charismatic man who wore tailored suits under his uniform jacket. He was the architect of the 42nd's extortion rings, ensuring that the dirty money flowed smoothly up the chain of command, shielding his men from internal affairs while taking the lion's share of the profits. His desk phone buzzed. It was O'Malley. "Captain, sorry to bother you." Jenkins brought in a John Doe, refuses to identify himself, making accusations about stolen cash. The guy is calm, too calm. He's asking to speak to the commanding officer. Hayes sighed, taking a sip of his scotch. Jenkins is an idiot. He probably shook down someone connected. "Bring the suspect to interrogation room B. No cameras. I'll handle it." 10 minutes later, the door to interrogation room B swung open. Arthur was seated at a steel table, his hands folded patiently in front of him. Captain Hayes strode in, flanked by Jenkins, who looked utterly defiant, and Miller, who looked like he was about to be physically sick. Hayes took the seat opposite Arthur, leaning back and resting his elbows on the armrests. He looked Arthur up and down, taking in the faded peacoat and the gray sweatshirt. He didn't see a threat. He saw a nuisance. "I am Captain Robert Hayes," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "My officers tell me you're causing trouble, refusing to identify yourself, throwing around wild accusations about theft. Now, we can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way. Who are you? And who do you work for?" Arthur met Hayes's gaze. His eyes were like twin black holes, absorbing the captain's arrogance and returning nothing but absolute, terrifying void. "I told your officers that they lacked reasonable suspicion to detain me," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the small, soundproofed room. "I told them they were violating my Fourth Amendment rights. Officer Jenkins proceeded to physically assault me, illegally search me, and steal federal property from my person." "Federal property?" Hayes scoffed, glancing at Jenkins, who rolled his eyes. "You're delusional, pal." "Officer Miller," Arthur commanded suddenly. The sharpness of his voice made the young cop jump. "Step forward." Miller looked at his captain, terrified. Hayes gave a slight, confused nod. Miller took a hesitant step toward the table. "Reach into the left inner breast pocket of my coat," Arthur instructed. "There is a concealed zipper. Open it." "Don't do it, Tommy," Jenkins snapped. "He might have a weapon we missed." "If he had a weapon, you should have found it during your illegal search." "Officer Jenkins," Arthur retorted sharply. "Do it, Miller." With trembling fingers, Miller reached inside Arthur's coat, found the hidden zipper, and pulled out a heavy, dark leather credentials wallet. He held it as if it were a live grenade. "Open it," Arthur said softly. "Read it aloud." For the captain, Miller flipped the leather casing open. The harsh fluorescent light of the interrogation room caught the gleaming, solid gold shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Beside it was an official photo identification card, bearing the seal of the United States Department of Justice. Miller stared at the card. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him a chalky, sickly white. His jaw worked silently for a moment before he finally found his voice. It came out as a horrified whisper. "Arthur Pendleton." Miller choked out, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it bordered on madness. Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The silence that fell over the interrogation room was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a vacuum. The glass of scotch in Captain Hayes's mind shattered. He leaned forward, snatching the leather wallet from Miller's trembling hands. He stared at the gold shield. He stared at the name. He looked up at the black man sitting calmly across from him, the man he had just dismissed as a street-level nuisance. Arthur Pendleton. The man appointed by the president. The man who commanded 35,000 federal agents. Jenkins froze. The smug, predatory grin melted off his face, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The $1,000 in his breast pocket suddenly felt like a branding iron burning through his uniform. "You," Hayes stammered, his polished veneer shattering into a million irreparable pieces. This is a mistake. Director Pendleton, I had no idea." "Ignorance of the law is not an excuse, Captain Hayes," Arthur said, his voice finally unleashing the full, crushing weight of his authority. He did not yell. He didn't have to. "You have built a kingdom of corruption in this precinct. You have preyed on the vulnerable, extorted the innocent, and hidden behind a badge that you have thoroughly disgraced. Director, please, let me explain," Hayes pleaded, standing up, his hands shaking. "Sit down!" Arthur's voice cracked like a rifle shot. Hayes fell back into his chair as if he had been physically struck. Arthur stood up slowly. He towered over the table. "You didn't arrest a suspect tonight, gentlemen. You abducted a federal officer. You committed armed robbery under the color of law. You engaged in a criminal conspiracy to deprive a United States citizen of their civil rights. You have crossed the Rubicon, and there is no way back." Jenkins began to hyperventilate, backing away toward the door. "I'm getting out of here." "You aren't going anywhere, Bradley," Arthur said softly. Suddenly, the heavy, muffled silence of the precinct was shattered. From outside the concrete walls, a deafening, rhythmic thudding filled the air. Whump, 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 the unmistakable sound of twin-engine Black Hawk helicopters descending onto the precinct's roof and the adjacent street. Seconds later, a massive, explosive crash echoed from the ground floor. The reinforced steel doors of the sally port and the front entrance had been simultaneously breached by heavily armored Bearcat vehicles. Sirens wailed, not police sirens, but the distinct, aggressive blare of federal emergency vehicles. The building actually shook as dozens of tactical boots hit the floorboards. Through the walls of the interrogation room, they heard the booming, electronically amplified voices echoing through the hallways. "FBI, everybody on the ground, drop your weapons. Drop your weapons now. Do not touch your communications." Captain Hayes buried his face in his hands, a pathetic sob escaping his lips. The empire he had built over a decade had just been annihilated in less than an hour. Officer Miller collapsed to his knees, burying his face in his hands, weeping openly. Jenkins stood paralyzed, staring blankly at the door. Hard karma had not just knocked. It had driven a battering ram through his life. The door to Interrogation Room B was kicked violently open. 4 massive men in heavy olive-drab tactical gear, Kevlar helmets, and carrying suppressed assault rifles flooded into the room. They bypassed Arthur entirely, instantly tackling Jenkins and Hayes to the linoleum floor, driving their faces into the dirt they had ruled for so long. Special Agent in Charge Richard Campbell stepped through the doorway, his weapon lowered but ready. He looked at the officers writhing on the floor under the boots of his HRT operators. And then he looked at Arthur. "Perimeter secured, Director," Campbell reported, his eyes flashing with righteous satisfaction. "The 42nd is ours." Arthur Pendleton reached down, calmly picked up his gold shield from the table, and slipped it back into his hidden pocket. He looked down at Jenkins, whose hands were being brutally zip-tied behind his back. "I told you," Arthur said quietly, his voice carrying over the chaos of the raid. "We were all going to learn a hard lesson tonight." The hostile takeover of the 42nd Precinct took exactly 4 minutes. It was a masterpiece of tactical precision, executed by federal agents who had spent over a year meticulously documenting the rot within these very walls. Inside Interrogation Room B, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and terrified sweat. Captain Robert Hayes, whose tailored suit was now smeared with the grime of the linoleum floor, was hauled to his feet by 2 heavily armored FBI operators. His hands were bound tightly behind his back with thick plastic flex cuffs. Beside him, Officer Bradley Jenkins was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as the brutal reality of his situation crushed the last remnants of his arrogance. Arthur Pendleton stood calmly amidst the tactical whirlwind. He brushed a speck of dust from his faded peacoat. Special Agent in Charge Richard Campbell approached Jenkins. Without a word, Campbell reached into Jenkins' uniform breast pocket and extracted the folded stack of $50 and $100 bills. He held the cash up to the harsh fluorescent light, then placed it carefully into a clear, tamper-evident federal evidence bag. "Armed robbery of a federal officer, under the color of law," Campbell stated, his voice a flat, clinical baritone. "Conspiracy to violate civil rights, assault, unlawful detention. You boys hit the jackpot tonight." "I didn't know!" Jenkins suddenly shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. The barroom brawler persona had completely evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, trembling shell. "I swear to God, I didn't know who you were. It was just a standard stop." Arthur stepped forward, closing the distance until he was inches from Jenkins' face. The director's expression was devoid of sympathy. "That is precisely the point, Bradley," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "You didn't know. You thought I was a nobody. You thought I was just another solitary black man walking in the rain, someone without the resources to fight back, someone whose word would never stand up against a sworn officer in court. You didn't do this because you suspected a crime. You did this because you believed you possessed absolute impunity." Jenkins squeezed his eyes shut as a tear of pure terror rolled down his cheek. "You swore an oath to protect the vulnerable," Arthur continued, his tone cutting like a scalpel. "Instead, you became the very predator you were paid to hunt. Tonight, you hunted the wrong man. Outside the interrogation room, the precinct was systematically being dismantled. Down at the booking desk, Sergeant William O'Malley was slammed against the wall, his crossword puzzle fluttering to the floor as an agent secured his wrists. The evidence room had already been breached by federal auditors, who were busy securing decades of falsified ledgers, stolen narcotics, and off-the-books cash that Hayes had been hoarding for his eventual retirement. "Director, the press pool has been notified," Sack Campbell reported, tapping his earpiece. "They are setting up outside the main barricade. The transport vans are ready." "Excellent," Arthur replied. He looked at the 3 ruined men before him. "Take them out through the front doors. Let the neighborhood see exactly what happens to the monsters in the dark." The perp walk was a scene of poetic, devastating justice. The rain was still falling steadily over the south side, but the street was no longer dark. It was illuminated by the glaring, blinding lights of a dozen local and national news vans. When the shattered doors of the 42nd Precinct swung open, the flashes of camera strobes erupted like a violent lightning storm. Jenkins, Miller, Hayes, and O'Malley were marched out into the freezing downpour. They were stripped of their badges, their weapons, and their dignity. They wore standard-issue orange federal jumpsuits over their uniforms, their hands shackled to heavy belly chains. The neighborhood, awakened by the helicopters and the flashbangs, had poured out onto the sidewalks. The very people these officers had terrorized, extorted, and beaten for years now stood behind the police tape, watching in stunned, vindicated silence. As Jenkins was shoved toward the back of a black armored FBI transport SUV, the exact same way he had shoved Arthur into his patrol car just an hour earlier, he looked out into the crowd. He saw the faces of the street vendors he had robbed. He saw the teenagers he had framed. Their eyes held no pity. They held only the cold, satisfying reflection of a tyrant's fall. The ensuing legal bloodbath was swift and merciless. Officer Thomas Miller, desperate to avoid spending the rest of his life in a maximum security cell, broke the blue wall of silence within 24 hours. He signed a comprehensive plea agreement with United States Attorney David Kensington, providing hundreds of hours of recorded testimony that detailed every extortion racket, every falsified police report, and every bribe that had flowed through the 42nd Precinct. The trial took place 8 months later in federal court. It was an absolute slaughter. Presiding Judge Harrison Caldwell showed zero leniency. The evidence was insurmountable. The dashcam footage the FBI had recovered from hidden precinct servers, the wiretaps, Miller's testimony, and the damning, undeniable testimony of the director of the FBI himself. Captain Robert Hayes was convicted of violating the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations RICO Act, along with 52 counts of civil rights violations. He was sentenced to 35 years in the United States Penitentiary, Lewisburg, a brutal, high-security facility where former cops were notoriously unwelcome. Officer Bradley Jenkins, the man who thought he was the law, was convicted of armed robbery, assault on a federal officer, and systemic deprivation of rights under the color of law. Judge Caldwell sentenced him to 22 years without the possibility of parole. As the gavel fell for the final time, echoing through the heavy oak panels of the courtroom, Arthur Pendleton sat quietly in the back row of the gallery. He watched Jenkins, pale and trembling, being led away in heavy iron leg irons. Arthur stood up, buttoned his tailored suit jacket, and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. He had a bureau to run. The South Side had its streets back. The predators had become the prey, locked inside cages of their own making, serving a hard, unrelenting sentence. Karma had not merely knocked on the door of the 42nd Precinct, it had kicked it off its hinges, and it had worn the face of the very man they thought they could break. Power unchecked is a poison, but justice, when finally awakened, is absolute. The corrupt officers of the 42nd Precinct learned too late that the badge is a shield for the innocent, not a weapon for the wicked. Their arrogance blinded them, turning a routine act of cruelty into their own spectacular destruction. Ultimately, the predators were caged, proving that true authority whispers, while false power merely screams before it falls.